Hello, this is Joseph McCarthy from the Irish Abroad Football Stats website. A few weeks ago, the historical data on Irish international games used to generate the stats posted on our social media accounts was pushed to our repo on github.com in JSON format. Away from running the site, I'm also a computer programmer, which is a big help when it comes to calculating the stats. In this video, I'm going to go through each file in the repo, explain its use with some simple examples, and show you how the stats are compiled. It'll help if you have used Git for source control or are familiar with github.com. It's not essential and you'll be able to use all the examples without knowing Git, but it will help you to get started. For most of the data, you're going to need to be familiar with JavaScript arrays and the functions associated with the array type, mainly the filter, sum, and find functions. I'll include links to explanations for these functions in the description. Also, to run the programs and recreate the stats on your own machine, you will need to have Node.js installed. So let's get started. Here you can see the repo on github.com. I'll include the link to the repo in the description. First, let's clone the repo locally. If you don't have Git installed, you can download the repo as a zip file using the link under the code button and then unzip the file locally on your machine. This does mean that you won't be able to pull any of the updates pushed to the repo using Git, but you can just download the zip file again. For what it's worth, I do recommend installing Git. Click the code link and copy the web URL using the button here. Once the alert appears to confirm the link is copied, open a command window and cd into the directory you want to clone the repo in. Enter git clone and then paste in the link that was copied to the clipboard. Once the repo has been cloned, cd into the repo directory and run npm install to install the node dependencies. If you open the directory in a file explorer, you can see the data is contained in 5 JSON files: countries, games, levels, managers, and players, and each one has a JavaScript, i.e. .js, file associated with it, with helper functions to pull the data from the associated JSON file, and an example of file using these functions. I'm going to go through each JSON file and show an example of how to use it. Let's start with the simplest file, levels.json. This is an array of the various levels that each game in games.json is played at, from friendly to World Cup. As you can see, each object in the array has 2 attributes, a numeric ID and the name of the level. The associated JavaScript file, levels.js, has one function, getLevelById, which returns the level object for a given ID. The function uses the array.find function to identify the level object with the same ID as the value passed to the function. If you run the levels.example.js file from the command line, you can see the results of the getLevelById function. Entering node levels.example.js 0 returns the JSON object for a friendly. Next, let's look at countries.json. As you might expect, this contains an array of the countries that have been faced by the Republic of Ireland International Football. Each object contains the name of the country, its flag as an emoji, and its FIFA-approved country code, also known as a trigram. The associated JavaScript file, countries.js, has one function, getCountryById, which uses the find function to return the country object for a given ID. Again, running the example file countries.example.js from the command line with the ID of the Republic of Ireland object, 0, as a parameter, returns the Republic of Ireland JSON object. The managers.json file contains an array of the managers of the national side. Each object has an ID, the manager's name, and an array containing the start and end date of each reign of the manager. Remember, some managers have been in charge more than once. This time, the associated JavaScript file, managers.js, has 2 functions, getManagerById, which returns the manager object for a given ID, and getManagerByDate, which searches the reigns array of each object to get the manager in charge of the national side on a given date. This time, we're going to see who was manager on the 1st of January 2002 by calling the manager.example.js file with 2002-01-01. As you can see, the answer is Mick McCarthy. Try it yourself with different dates, but remember the date has to be written as year-month-date. Players.json contains an array of objects for each player that has appeared for the national side. Each object contains an ID, the player's first name and surname, and where available, their position, their date of birth, their date of death, and their Twitter handle. The birth dates of some of the earliest players to appear for Ireland have unfortunately been lost. Similar to the other files we've looked at, the players.js library has one function, getPlayerById, which returns the object with an ID corresponding to the value passed to the function. Using the players.example.js file, we can find the object for ID 321, and you can see it's Niall Quinn. Finally, let's look at games.json. This contains an array where each object in the array represents a game played by the Republic of Ireland. Each object contains an ID, the date, a level value corresponding to an object in levels.json. The starting players and substitutes are contained in two arrays, where each object contains a player ref attribute, which references the ID from players.json, and substituted on and introduced on attributes where appropriate. The home team and away team are mapped to objects with the ID of the country matching an object in countries.json and what that team scored. The bookings and sendings off of a game are stored in arrays in the game object itself, but the goals scored by Irish players are handled differently. They're stored in an array in the relevant team object. This is because an Irish player can score for both teams in a game, i.e. an OG. But obviously they can only be booked or sent off for one team. Games.js has four functions: get game by ID, which returns the game object for a given ID; get player introductions, which returns an array of the games where a given player was introduced; get player starts, which returns the games where a player was named in the starting 11; and get player caps, which returns all games where a player appeared. These latter three methods use the array.sum function to identify a game object where any object in the starting 11 or substitutes array contains an object with a player ref attribute equal to a given player ID. In the games.example.js file, the example combines each of the other libraries with games.js to get a game by its ID, then lists the details of that game, that is, the scoreline, the level the game was played at, the date, the manager, and the lineup, using the same code shown in the previous examples. Let's see what the lineup was for game 299 in the games.json array. Open a terminal and enter the command node games.example.js 299. And as you can see, it's the team that played against Italy in Ireland's famous win over the Azzurri in World Cup USA 1994. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to analysing the stats files for Irish international games. In the next episode, I'll show you how the stat from the friendly against Belgium in March was arrived at. Alan Brown scored 9 minutes after coming on as a substitute against Belgium, but who was the last substitute to score in less time after being introduced? Thanks for watching. Like, share and subscribe to the channel to see the answer in the next video.